Right. Well, thank you for that welcome, Bob. I appreciate it. And yes, the American Revolution has been a love of my life, going back to when I was 5 years old, and I opened up my father's tricentennial three-volume illustrated history of Connecticut, and I opened up the second volume, which was on the period of the American Revolution. And it unlike most of your regular history books, it was more like a graphic novel. It was, like except it was black and white, and it had four pictures. I couldn't read, but I could look at the pictures, and a lot of it happened to focus on Fort Griswold. I didn't know that. I just looked at the pictures and tried copying the pictures. I knew that the British wore red and the Americans wore blue, supposedly, when I was 5 years old. I draw pictures, copying those drawings, using my crayons, etc. But that's how far back my love of this goes, and I never forgot that. And of course, growing up in Connecticut, Fort Griswold, well, it wasn't around the corner, but it was close to where my uncle lived. He lived in New London. So I did, when I got old enough to go out and visit the fort, which exists still. It's a state park. I did so. And I tried to read as much as I could, but there's not much out there, frankly, on the battle that took place at Fort Griswold. It's unfortunate. And I looked in vain. I found simply one pamphlet that was put out by a graduate student, which was concentrating on the issue of the myth of how Colonel Ledyard, who was the commanding officer of the American forces in that part of Connecticut, was supposedly slain with his own sword by attempting to surrender at Fort Griswold. So that was about it. And ultimately I tried to get other people to write this book, but I couldn't. So I had to undertake the task of researching it and putting it all together, because it is a fascinating story. And it's a little known story. It's based on the timing of when it took place. It took place on September 6th, 1781, literally 6 weeks before active campaigning in the American Revolution ended with the surrender at Yorktown. And I think that the news of this particular engagement and the slaughter that took place there, the massive casualties, it's the bloodiest battle that ever took place in the state of Connecticut, was kind of lost in the good news of the surrender of Cornwallis's army at Yorktown. So that's why I think it's little known. We are fortunate that the fort still exists, that it wasn't destroyed by the British after the battle. There's a story about that. And that it continued to operate as a military base until the early 20th century, when it was turned over to the state of Connecticut, and pretty much in the shape that it was during the American Revolution. It's truly remarkable. It is something to see. So let's talk about where it is and why it was important at the time, not just because it was the bloodiest battle ever fought in the state of Connecticut, but what was behind it, and what we're talking about casualties. Why did I call it the Alamo of the Revolution? Well, there were about 165 defenders of the fort. 88 of them were killed outright. Another 35 were wounded, some of them mortally. 27 were captured, and some of them also were wounded, or some of them actually died of the effects of being imprisoned at the Sugar House in New York City after they were transported. There were only 13 that escaped, and some of them suffered serious injuries in their escape. Basically jumping over the walls of the fort to once they realized the British were not accepting anybody surrendering. They were going to kill them if they surrendered. So you can do the math. It's pretty substantial casualties, a near massacre. And the attacking British also suffered massive losses. Probably about 650 British that assaulted. It might have been a few less, could not have been more than that. And there are two British regiments, the 40th Regiment and the 54th Regiment. Now, what you have here to cover my book, and it's the only really good painting that has been produced on the assault at Fort Griswold, and it was done by none other than Don Traiani in the early 1970s. He did a series of paintings for American Heritage magazine, and because he too was living in Connecticut, at Stamford, Connecticut, he knew about the Fort Griswold, and he undertook to do this painting, featured in the 1973, I don't remember which month it was, but that, I always had a copy of that. And this is a real trail of the climactic assault on the south wall of Fort Griswold by the 40th Regiment. And you can go into the details. There's some inaccuracies. I can go through that later on. But the point is, you can see what a desperate fight it was, and bloody engagement that it was.
Jerry, could you enlarge the screen or start the PowerPoint, please?
I don't know if I can. I'll try. Don't know that I can. Let me see if I can.
Yeah, from the beginning.
Number one. At the top there, it just says begin from beginning. Hit from beginning.
From the beginning. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Well, let's see. Is that better?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Okay. So you can get a good picture of this. This, as I said, a very good, an excellent painting of showing the desperate assault. And you can see the flag in the back. I'll talk about the flag, but this is taken from the fate, William, the sources of where we get our material. Most of it comes from maps, 3 maps. And you will see those maps as we go through on this in my presentation. So let's go to the next. Okay, well, we've already talked about this. Let's go back a little bit. We can't seem to go back. All right. Or we'll get to the similar maps. But this is the composition of the British forces. Now, let's a little history here. Connecticut was constantly being raided by British forces since 1777. You had the raid on Danbury. Most of the port towns were hit by the British. New Haven was burnt. Stratford, Norwalk. These are all cities that were put to the torch. Up and down, as I said, the Connecticut coast. New London was not attacked. It was further inland. New London had a very deep harbor. It had 6,000. It was a large town for its time. 6,000 settlers in New London on the Thames River, and this is all the way in the eastern part of the state of Connecticut. On the other side of the Thames River is Groton. Of course, you might know New London as being where the Coast Guard Academy is, and in Groton, which across on the other side, directly across from New London, on the eastern side of the Thames River, is where the base is located. So it was not attacked by the British. It was blockaded, but they did not go in, probably because you had Fort Griswold was being built. The Americans recognized the importance of the fort early on and built 3 separate fortifications to defend the harbor. Fort Griswold being the most important because it sat in Groton on a what was called which is a terminal moraine from the Ice Age, and it essentially towered over the river on the eastern side of the river, directly across from the harbor at New London, about 3/4 of a mile. So it was an ideal place to put a fort, and it was done, properly done in the 18th century manner with bastions, braziers, raising ditches, a fosse around all 16 feet tall, made of earth and stone. So it was a powerful fortification. Unfortunately, it was significantly undermanned, and it was really designed to cover the harbor with its guns overlooking the river. They paid less attention to the eastern portion of the fort, which the land side. We'll talk about that later on. On the other side of the river, the New London side, you had Fort Trumbull. But Fort Trumbull was really just a water battery, and it was almost kind of diagonally further south of Fort Griswold. Fort Griswold was 3 miles inland, again from the mouth of the Thames River, which was pretty wide, 3 miles wide. And as I said, it was a deep harbor. And then there was, so since it was simply a water battery, Fort Trumbull had to be defended. They didn't make a wall. Instead, they built another fort called Fort Town Hill, which sat to the rear of Fort Trumbull and was supposed to provide cover fire for anybody trying to attack Fort Trumbull from the land side. And it was simply a stockaded affair. It was manned all by militia. It really didn't work. So we'll get into that later on. So you have this particular situation where New London had been blockaded, and then when the British abandoned Newport, the blockade was off, and the privateers, many of them built in New London, went on a spree of raiding British merchantmen. And in the end of July of 1781, they seized a grand prize of the Hannah, which was destined for New York Harbor, which was loaded with luxury goods destined for the officers of the British Army stationed in New York. And it was a rich prize that was brought into the harbor in New London. And obviously, there were some aggrieved British officers in New York. And the captain from the Hannah went and complained to Henry Clinton about, why aren't you doing something about this nest of pirates that are located in England? Why don't you take that town out? Well, the British had attempted to do so in 1780, but there were a lot of American militia available, and they were put off by 3,000 American militia that stayed around New London and in the forts around New London for a couple of weeks, and the British gave up on assaulting it. Now we have a different situation. Benedict Arnold is now on the British side, and he knows New London because he grew up in Norwich, Connecticut. I'm showing you a map, one of the maps that's very instrumental in telling the story of what happened. This is showing where you can see here, Fort Griswold. There's the harbor of New London. There is Fort Trumbull here, the water battery. And over here is Fort Town Hill, otherwise known as Fort Folly or Fort Nuns. That's how much the Americans thought of the fort. So you can see this was map created by Daniel Lyman, who was a member of Benedict Arnold's regiment, his loyalist regiment called the American Legion. Interesting name. That was the name that of his unit, made up of many Connecticut loyalists. There were the attacking force. We're going to go to the next one here. This is the lower end of showing a picture of the mouth of the Thames River, and the forces. If you really were to zero in, it will name where the various units that were there on both sides of the river. Arnold led the New London side, the western side of the Thames River assault, made up primarily of loyalist regiments with only one British regiment, 38 Regiment. It also had one cannon and 60 Jaegers, the German riflemen that usually shouted out in front of the rest of the approaching troops if they were trained for skirmishing, and unlike the rest of the troops, carried rifles. On the other side of the river was a primarily British regular force composed of the 40th Regiment, very famous for the defense at Germantown. They were also at Princeton, and the 54th Regiment, commanded by Colonel Edmund Eyre. Eyre was in charge of that part of the assault on Groton and New London. It's on the eastern side of the Thames River. Again, there were 60 Jaegers along the lead, and there were 2 cannon as opposed to 1 cannon because they might have to use the cannon to take out Fort Griswold. There was 1 loyalist unit, the 3rd New Jersey Provincial Battalion. That battalion was left behind to guard the guns because it was going to take a lot longer to manhandle the guns 3 miles to come up to the fort. And of course, it was a rough 3 miles. It was going up a hill, so it's going to take some time to get up there. So the Jaegers went ahead, and the 2 British regiments went ahead to see what they could do to the fort. Arnold wanted that fort taken out because he wanted to be able to show the ships, primarily the privateers, that were stuck in the harbor. When Arnold came at 3 a.m. To make the assault, he couldn't land because of the tide being out and because of the winds. Couldn't get close enough. But those same winds and the tide kept the privateers from escaping up the river. They couldn't go anywhere, so they were stuck. And the Americans had an extra 6 hours to try to, prepare a defense. Arnold knew the secret signal for alerting the militia to come out, which was firing 2 cannon shots from Fort Griswold. But 3 cannon shots from Fort Griswold meant a prize ship was coming in, and Arnold knew that, and the Americans never changed that. So after the 2 alarm shots went off at Fort Griswold to get all the militiamen to turn out, Arnold made sure another shot went off so that they would think a merchantman was coming, a prize ship was coming in. And they would go back to bed. And a lot of the American militia did go back to bed, unfortunately. So they had to be aroused by sending out riders. So that kind of delayed the response. All right, so now you have the assault going up and getting prepared. Arnold had no problem. He took out the back of Fort Trumbull easily. Fort Town Hill, Fort Folly fell apart right away. They didn't put up virtually no resistance. And 3 boats left. The garrison tried to escape across the river to Fort Griswold. And 2 of the ships did succeed. 2 of the boats, the long boats, succeeded in bringing reinforcements to Fort Griswold. Fort Griswold only had 25 men. It could not do anything without having reinforcements. Reinforcements came in 2 other directions, not just by the 17 additional men from the Fort Trumbull garrison, but also by the fact that Ledyard made an appeal to the privateers, the captains on the ships, that he needed their help to defend the port. And some of them stepped forward at the expense of losing their ships, and they volunteered, and many of them were very experienced in, of course, manning cannon, and they came to help out in the fort. But the bulk of the troops that went into the fort were the militia that were from Groton, and they filed into the fort, so that the numbers finally came up to about 165. But there were hundreds of more troops available that refused to go into the fort. They stood out a few hundred yards and watched. They would not, if they had come into the fort, things might have been very different, but they didn't. But there were 165 men, so it was more than a token force. And Arnold thought, again, there were only 25 men in the fort. It shouldn't be a big deal about taking the fort. And he had given instructions that fort was to be taken. And Eyre was going to follow. Pardon. Okay. All right, here's the fort. Okay, now in this is a fort by, this is an engraving by William Faden in London, who did a lot of engravings for the king that showed, a lot of American battlefields and fortifications. So this is again, picture of the map of the fort, and you can see there's the rock outcropping, the boulder that was incorporated into the walls of the fort. There's the flag. The magazine is here in this southwest bastion. Here's the northwest bastion. You can see how the guns are pretty much towards the river, the Thames River. This is the western side. And you notice that there are open embrasures on both the north and the south walls right here. This is a ditch that went down to the water battery and went through the sally port, which is right here, where troops could sally out, and it was done in such a way that it zigged and zagged, and whoever was right had a better defense. Basically only one man at a time could get through that sally. So of course, it was not used as a mechanism to get into the fort. But the 18-pounder, the heaviest gun in the fort, is located right over here in the southeast corner. Again, notice there are no bastions here, and unfortunately, there are no guns in this triangular fletch that's located here, which could have provided enfiladating fire against attackers on the east. That didn't exist. But the 9-pounders that are located here and here would enfilade any attacking force that came to attack the wall. And the walls were designed to be about 16 feet tall. They had phrasing. Phrasing are these stakes, sharpened stakes that are about 12 feet long, embedded in the earthen portion of the fort, and at an angle, either a downward 45-degree angle or at an upward 45-degree. The point was they were placed side by side so that you couldn't get through to attack the parapet. You couldn't get up there without creating an opening. And all the time you're in the ditch and you can't even reach these stakes without often having to put somebody on your shoulders to try to jiggle them out from the earthen part of the wall. And all the time, of course, being fired upon. The British would. So this was an undertaking. They had no ladders. They had no axes. This was going to be difficult for them to penetrate into the fort. Okay, so this is, here is, all right, this is an extremely important map, which is a hand-drawn map by Ensign Alexander Gray. And it has more details noted. It doesn't show the embrasures and exactly where each cannon, but these letters, it tells a different story than the Faden map. And of course, this is done by an eyewitness, Ensign Gray of the 40th Regiment. So you can see, and these numbers all signify there is, of course, where Major Montgomery would be killed. Coming through the embrasure. We're doing on time here. We're getting all right. Okay, so again, a very important source of information about what happened at the fort. Okay, so let's see how this developed. This is at the very beginning of the engagement. The British get up there. While this is going on, Arnold is already in New London and burning the town. The whole purpose of attacking the fort is largely going away. Whatever privateers are in there that were still manned, managed. The wind, the tide came in, and they were able to get over the bar and get up to Norwich. But a lot of the ships, of course, could not, and they were stuck in the harbor and were destroyed. There was fires going on in New London, and basically, Arnold had accomplished what he meant to accomplish. There was no point in attacking the fort, but he had given these strict orders about taking the fort. And in order to have his order to withdraw his order to attack, he had to have someone get in a rowboat and cross the river to withdraw the order to attack the fort. was too late. It was really too late. They had a parley. The British Ire threatened that if the Americans did not surrender, no quarter would be given to the defenders. And the Americans rejected that. They thought the reinforcements they could see the American militia a few hundred yards off. If they came into the fort, that would have been it. The British could not be successful, but they refused. That didn't happen. They did not respond to an appeal being made. Which, as you could see where the 54th and 40th did and where they launched their assault. You see the guns over here on Avery Hill. Those came up after the battle was over, along with the 3rd New Jersey. They were not in the battle. It was just the 40th and the 54th, and I said about 650 men. With the 54th going to the left and the 40th to the right, there was a fortification over here, a Fletch, open-ended triangular embrasure that was there, that had some 4-pounders to slow up the British. They were loaded. They were fired off. Don't know how much damage they did. The Americans claimed they did a lot of damage to the British, but the one officer who was there, he ran. He was all by himself in that particular Fletch, and then he ran down the hill because he couldn't get into the fort, and he basically went into a cornfield and for the remainder of the battle. At this point, the British are forming a column, and the idea is to attack the corners of the fort, try to minimize the impact of all the musketry and the cannon fire by concentrating on a corner where there could be fewer guns could be placed on the British. Unfortunately for them, the 18-pounder was located in this corner right there where they were going to initially concentrate the assault. And they took out, the British being in column formation, unfortunately took massive casualties from that 18-pounder. And that really stymied the initial stages of the attack. They were making no headway in attacking the fort, inflicting virtually no casualties on the American defenders, but taking casualties. And Lieutenant Colonel Eyre, the commander of the British forces here, was wounded, seriously wounded, and that meant that Major Montgomery had to take over. And they were thinking that this was not going to be worthwhile doing. They were taking a lot of casualties, and they started to withdraw. At that time, somebody shot the halyard holding the flag up. The flag came down. Of course, a flag coming down meant that the fort was being surrendered, and the British took that as a sign the Americans had come to their senses and were surrendering, which was, of course, not the case. The Americans, as quickly as they could, fashioned the flag onto a pike and hoisted the flag up again. But in the interim, the British were approaching at a walking pace, thinking they had nothing to fear, and the Americans are firing on them. And they felt that the Americans did this deliberately to entice them to get within musket range so that they could be shot at again. And this enraged the British. And they came in and again, immediately tried to get it back into the fort. And this is at this stage, they're wrapping around the southwest bastion. And this is where they discover that they could get into the fort by going up the boulder. The boulder being perpendicular, the defenders couldn't fire on them, couldn't even see them when they were behind that boulder. And they were able to basically gain entrance into the fort, one man at a time, into that bastion. By doing so, they could take out the 9-pounder that was enfilading the assaulting columns on the south wall, where Major Montgomery was located. Montgomery did make it through. They apparently created openings in the phrasing and were able to get through the unoccupied embrasures that are there. You certainly didn't want to attack an embrasure that had a cannon, at its mouth. So he was going through that embrasure, and there was a mobile force of defenders that were located in the raid area of the fort, and they had pikes. They had those 8-foot pikes, which very effective in hand-to-hand combat, of course, used primarily on ships. And Jordan Freeman, the servant of Ledyard, Colonel Ledyard, the overall commander of that part of Connecticut, was there with one of these pikes. And when Montgomery came through the embrasure, he was impaled on the pike. And there is a plaque, and I'll show you that a little bit later. So the British second in command was killed right then and there. But meanwhile, while this was going on, the 9-pounder was taken out so that the British could make an easier entrance into the south wall. And a couple of the British soldiers attempted to go across the parade ground to the north gate and open up the north gate. And a flood of British troops came in. And they were out bloodthirsty. They would not accept anybody's surrender. And then that's when the Americans took most of their casualties. And there are some stories of desperate fighting when those who realized that you couldn't surrender, you either had to fight, there was just no way out. Some jumped off the walls of the fort. Others hid in the magazine. And the British were firing volleys into the magazine, which was foolhardy because they all would have blown up together if they set the magazine on fire. And that took a British officer to stop the madness that was going on. 2 Americans played dead and got under the dead bodies, and just because, again, you had to do something to save your life. You couldn't surrender. Colonel Ledyard had tried to surrender the fort, and he was killed. And there was a whole mythology of the fact that he surrendered his sword, and his sword was taken, and the sword was used to slay him. Well, they do have his waistcoat, and the waistcoat's rips that are there seem to reflect that the killing was done with a bayonet, not with a sword. So Colonel Ledyard was killed there, and of course, also his servant, Jordan Freeman, and his nephew, they were all killed on that. So what you have, and here's my detailed map showing where the forces are, and again, showing where the open embrasures are. So you get an idea. There was no ditch, as I said, on the south. That was a mistake. The two Americans who played dead played an important role in that. By staying in the fort, the other prisoners were moved, wounded were taken in a wagon, which unfortunately had a fortunate accident on the way down the hill. Because again, it's built on a hill, and they were being pulled by prisoners, and the broke, and the wagon went rolling down the hill into a tree. It was pretty bad. But the those two soldiers who were playing dead were, the British had set up a fuse to blow up fort, with blow up the magazine in the fort, and those 2 Americans put out the saving the fort, what we have today. Okay, some pictures quickly. This is the rotten Fort Griswold monument next to the fort. It was built and completed in 1830, a couple of years before the Bunker Hill Monument. And as you can see, this is the distance from it and Fort Trumbull, which had been taken by the British. I'll give you a little bit of an idea, perspective. This is the west wall of the fort. That's the southwest bastion. There's the Thames River. You can just get an idea of the This is the south wall. The climactic assault took place. This is the Sally Port. This is the trench that allowed soldiers to pass down to the the guns and the water battery. This over here on the left side is the Bastion, Southwest Bastion, and of course this is the South. So you can see the part of it, the stone, and then the earthen cover on the top. And this would have had raising, essentially those stakes, sharpened stakes along all of the earthen areas of the fort. This is the interior of the fort. This is the sally port. And you just saw the entrance on the other side. Here is the gate into the door into the magazine. The Americans did not have prepared charges, another bad mistake. So they constantly, every time they wanted to load a cannon, they had to run to the magazine to have a prepared cartridge made to bring back. And you had runners running in there, and one of them was a young man, about 15 years old, Daniel Williams, who shouldn't have been there. He was there. He was a substitute that his father had sent him out in exchange for a keg of cider to allow one of the soldiers of the garrison at Fort Trumbull to stay with his sick wife. Up here this is where the flagpole is. This is the Southwest Bastion. Again, this is a shot from where the 9-pounder would have been located, looking down at the south wall, and this is where the 18-pounder would have been. This is the boulder that allowed entry into the fort. So you can see how this would have protected an attacker. It would have been very difficult to get at the attacker coming up this. Okay, this is looking on the north wall. This is from the northeast corner, looking out toward the northwest bastion. There is a trench here. This is to increase the height. And you would have the 9-pounder located here, so it would enfilade the attackers coming on. Here's the redan that protected the gate. This is where the front gate, which was open, located. This is a picture taken from approximately where the 18-pounder was located on the southeastern portion of the fort. This is the Southwest Bastion. This is where approximately the 9-pounder was situated. You can see the river in the background. You have an idea, and there's the flag. So here's a plaque that was put up to mark the spot close to the spot where Major Montgomery came through, showing Jordan Freeman with a half pike about to impale Major Montgomery. And again, this is a map I have of where certain people where I figured out certain people were located in the fort. To tell a story about a defense of a fort, you need to, you get all these stories, but you don't know where they were in the fort, and you have to figure out what was their perspective when they report on what happened. Okay, any questions? Now, as I mentioned to you, casualties were pretty devastating. By the way, this was Benedict Arnold's last battle. He didn't fight anymore. This was it. And notwithstanding the success that he had in taking out New London, there was a lot of repercussions from all the casualties that were taking Fort Griswold.
Overall, how long did the attack last?
Probably not more than an hour. Not more than an hour. Less than that.
Well, thank you, Jerry. That's a very interesting presentation of a little known event. And I appreciated the fact that you said that, it was overshadowed by the battle at Yorktown, which happened just slightly after. So what questions do folks have for Jerry?
I have a
Yes.
question. I have a question. What happened to Benedict Arnold after this battle?
Well, really not. There were no repercussions in any kind of like formal inquiries or anything like that. He wrote up this written report, all the supplies that were captured, and of course all the damage that was done. There was significant damage done to the fort and to the town. But again, it left a sour taste in I know when he realized how many British regulars were lost, and ultimately, with the surrender at Yorktown, it was a big waste. It did not affect the outcome of the war. It didn't prevent Washington from taking his army and going south to Virginia. It had been part of the the plan that he would somehow be distracted by this assault.
Was this the last battle that Arnold fought with the British?
Yes, very last battle he fought with anybody.
So I see.
It's kind of funny. You don't find it. It's not mentioned in any of his. You don't find it in the biographies. They somehow miss this important this culmination of his military career took place here.
I see that Deborah Dickey has a question. Deborah?
Well, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, more of a comment. I was actually founding president of the Friends of Fort Griswold about 27 years ago. And they had this idea that was popular in the 60s, and it came back again in the 90s about actually keeping the Groton Monument to commemorate the battle and raising the fort because it was its prime real estate for luxury condos.
Mhm.
So a bunch of us got together and, formed the Friends. And I just wanted to comment on the effect it had on the community. That you had over 200 children left fatherless, but it was all malicious. So it was all local men. And of those local men, 15 Averys fought and 9 were killed. And the Perkins family had 6 men fight, including Elnathan Perkins, who was the oldest there. And he was almost 65 when he was killed. He fought with his 4 adult sons, and only 1 son survived.
Wow.
And the community was terribly bitter.
I would bet.
They was extremely bitter because they had the tombstones were just incredible. There was one double tombstone that said, 2 brothers killed by troops under the command of that despicable parasite, Benedict Arnold.
Parasite.
Yeah. I see we lost everybody, but I just wanted to comment on how horrendously devastating it was for the area. And there are literally direct descendants that still live within a few hundred feet of the fort.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, it was and the Marquis de Lafayette actually commented, remember Fort Griswold. And when he made his farewell tour in 1825 of the United States, he stopped and saw Mother Bailey, who had come into the fort right after and actually became a heroine of the War of 1812 because she took off her petticoat to use for cannon wadding but he actually paid a visit to her in her home with all his entourage.
Wow.
Cool. Okay.
So we're working hard at getting things done, and there have been some changes since the last time Jerry was there.
Look forward to seeing it one of these days.
It's quite a sight because they are the original ramparts from 1775 and the original stonework,
Wow.
and no luxury condos.
Good on you.
So I guess you won.
Other questions or comments about Jerry's talk?
Jerry,
Yeah.
good evening, Jerry. Yeah, Nick Bedard in Virginia now. Jerry and I go way back to about 1988 as Civil War reenactors. And I had
Right.
the great fortune of caring for both his mother and father in my medical practice and sampling the bread that his family made in Bristol. My questions, Jerry, how many of the defenders were men of color or of the local Indian tribes?
Yeah,
I-
very excellent question, because, when you want to look at a battle that's kind of representative of people in America, you had two black soldiers, two African Americans, both killed in defending the fort.
And
One was a slave and one was a free man. Jason, Jordan Freeman, the one who slayed actually the commanding officer with the pike. The other was a Pequot Indian, and the Pequot Indian was wounded. Tom Wensack. My understanding is that the families of these men, or at least I know, I guess, of Jordan Freeman, supposedly in town. I wish I had interviewed them, talked to them, just to get a more of a flavor for Jordan Freeman.
I actually went to high school with one of his descendants, and they literally live within about a block of the fort still. And he was Colonel Ledyard's manservant. And
Right.
and actually we have just put in and haven't unveiled yet a monument to Jordan Freeman to note that he was a Black American. And, we're working on that aspect. And they've also put in granite blocks that outline where the fort was, which much larger than the map indicates, because the barracks were almost 1/3 of the interior of the fort. And they've also put on a wooden parapet, is that how you say it?
You're right.
Back on the southwest bastion.
Yeah. I mean, that was it is an incredible story. By the way, I don't know this, but how tall were the barracks? Was it like a 2-story barracks or
One story, as far as I
One
can tell. As far as I know, one story.
That one story of, I think it was Esther Brothers, one of them jumping onto the barracks from the wall. So that's why I figured where he was, because in order for him to do that, he probably had to be on the eastern wall in order to do that, to leap for safety to get up on. I guess he was up close to the roof.
Yeah, it
Anyway.
was. Oh, fuck.
a lot of fascinating stories, and of course, the Pequot Indian who was there, along with a descendant of John Mason, who was the great slaughterer of the Pequot Indians in the Pequot War. One of the principal engagement, which took place a few miles to the east of Groton, where a Pequot Indian village was surrounded by Connecticut militia and the Narragansett tribe.
I noticed that we have a couple of questions on the chat, so let me read one from Bob Wong, who asks, were the prisoners taken to New York City?
They were taken to the Sugar House. Yeah, in New York. Yes, well, the Sugar.
An interesting side story to the prisoners is that Colonel Ledyard's brother, Ebenezer Ledyard, offered himself as a hostage so that the wounded Americans wouldn't be taken prisoner. And I actually am acquainted now with the Ledyard family descendants who live in Alabama. And they said that Ebenezer became so friendly with his British captor, the commander, that he actually named his next child after him.
Wow.
He became that friendly with the British captor. And from what the understanding is, the British officer treated him very well.
Yeah. And here's another question from our chat. Who is Fort Griswold named for?
Lieutenant Governor of Connecticut.
Okay.
Not the governor, he was the lieutenant governor. Trumbull was the governor, the very famous wartime governor of Connecticut. And unlike other colonies, the governors of Connecticut were elected by the people, not appointed by the king. It wasn't a royal colony. Most of the colonies by then had appointed governors. So Connecticut was one of those, privileged states that elected their own governor.
The lieutenant governor was named Matthew Griswold, And I actually met Matthew Griswold the 10th.
The 10th.
And I think we're up to Matthew Griswold the 11th now.
Wow.
So
Well,
he did become the governor, I think, afterwards, after
Yes.
Trumbull left. He became the governor. But it's kind of interesting that they named the better fort, the more spectacular fortification after the lieutenant governor and not the governor, Trumbull. Governor Trumbull was very famous, but they just named the water battery after him.
The fort was actually used through the Spanish-American War. And in World War I, it had a machine gun battery. In World War II, they had anti-aircraft guns there. And during a big Homeland Security thing around 2000, they actually put the cameras to survey the whole area on top of the 135-foot monument.
wow.
Yeah.
We have other questions for Jerry?
Yes, I have a question. Jerry, were there any retribution for the militia who just kind of stood around outside the fort?
Well, no, not specifically for standing around the fort. There were some of those depredations or stole property from the fort, or there's in my book there's a whole list of court proceedings against the American American militia soldiers that went astray. Also, of course, against the commanding officer of the, I think it's the 8th Connecticut Regiment, that was supposed to be defending New London on that side. Colonel Harris, he was the one that suddenly said he felt sick, and he rode off saying, "I don't feel well," and while the militia was assembling and ready to defend New London, he rides off saying he's sick, and he does not appoint anybody else to assume command of the militia. So yes, there were repercussions.
One of the little interesting sidelights, of course, of the British being buried on the fort after was that Major Montgomery's family came back and, took his head on from the mass grave at the fort, and only his skull, and took it back to England to put in the family crypt. Yeah,
So I
I
guess,
have been trying to get them to put a memorial for the British dead, because it wasn't just British dead. There was also loyalists, and it did make me very popular for a while. But I figure if they can have a stone to honor the dead British at Concord, and there were so many loyalists at this battle, but I'm still working on it.
so there's a mass grave there? There's a mass grave there, I guess, for the British,
Yes,
and unmarked.
unmarked.
Wow.
I actually got really attacked for saying that we should have something, but I'm still trying.
Good luck.
I have one other question. Relative to the plaque, was the design of the plaque made through some kind of a competition to what to include on it?
That I don't know. It's been there a long time.
I often felt it was denigrating to Gordon Freeman, because it pictures him as looks like he came right out of the cotton field, as a slave, and he was anything but that. You're talking about representative of the commanding officer of Eastern Connecticut. I mean, he would have been dressed. He would have been well dressed. He was representative of Colonel Ledyard. He probably would have been better dressed than virtually all the other soldiers.
And you also mentioned the Pequot Indian, Tom Wamsuck.
Yes.
And the fact that his name was even included on the plaque was a big deal, because for decades and decades, people would not even say the word Pequot. So for that to be recognized at the time it was with the plaque was a big deal.
Wow.
And as an interesting aside, the monument was built entirely from public funds raised by a lottery that was ran by none other than P.T. Barnum as one of his first jobs.
Incredible. Wow. Do we have any other?
Definitely
questions?
one should go there. I mean,
Yeah. Hey, I'd like to let you know about what is coming up for our Washington Crossing roundtable. So let me make sure I've got this up.
Oh.
Um,
Wow.
Hold on a second. We'll get to, there we go. Play from start. There. Okay. So now I should be able to, I'd like to first of all let you know that the Washington Crossing American Revolution Roundtable, we're sponsored by the Swan Historic Foundation. The Swan Historical Foundation owns the collection of artifacts at the Washington Crossing State Park in New Jersey. There are about 900 Revolutionary War era artifacts on display there. And the state of New Jersey is going to be building us a new visitors center. They're going to break ground early in 2023, and we hope that it's ready by about 2024. So we hope you could take a chance to come down and visit us there in Jersey at Washington Crossing on the Jersey side. We have 2 upcoming topics for 2022 yet. We meet quarterly, and in September, we're going to hear from Bruce Gill, who is the curator of the Harriton House, which was Charles Thompson's home. Charles Thompson was the secretary to the Continental Congress, and we are indebted to him for all that we know about the actions of Congress during the period of the Revolution. So this should be a fascinating talk. And then Joe Robleski, who's with us this evening. Joe will be speaking with us in December about Washington's return to Jersey, his second Battle of Trenton, and then the march to Princeton in January of 1777, the wrap up of the 10 crucial days. So we hope you're able to join us for that. And finally, I'd like to let you know that we have a website. Here it is. It's part of the Swan Historical Foundation. They host it for us. And we also have a YouTube channel where we've posted, I guess, the last 6 or 7 talks that we've had. And we'll post Jerry's talk there sometime over the next week or two. I'll be sending out a reminder to people with the link to Jerry's talk in about 2 weeks, probably.